In that when I was a graduate student, if somebody had told me that one day I would be invited to address a conference called The Future of Visual Anthropology, I would have been extremely surprised. I never took a course on visual anthropology, and when I came back from my doctoral field work, I had just a couple hundred photos that were pretty much snapshots. I had a lot of pamphlets and cartoons that the environmentalists produced, but I did not make a lot of images during that time. And only a few of those made it into my dissertation. But here I am, and so what changed? And what I'm going to be talking about today is about what changed. I'm going to be discussing the developments in anthropology, in visual media, and in the world we live in that have motivated this shift for me, and I think for many other people in the discipline who maybe did not start out as anthropologists who thought of themselves as visual anthropologists, but who now are entering this rich and incredible field. I came to participatory visual methods as a research mode through years of studying urban environments. First in post-socialist Hungary, then increasingly now in New England and in Lisbon, Portugal. And I'm going to say a few things about different approaches to studying the anthropology of urban environments, or to studying urban environments. Anthropologists have studied these in many different ways over the years. There's beliefs about urban space and how these relate to power, and that is in the work of folks like James Holston, who wrote about urban planning in Brasilia, or Gary McDonough on the gentrification of Barcelona's port. There's also a very rich literature on senses of place and place attachment. Senses of place is the term that comes from Stephen Feld and Keith Basso, not necessarily working in visual modes, although Stephen Feld ended up sort of creating the field of sonic ethnography during his work in Papua New Guinea. And Setha Lowe, her work on place attachment and the sensory and affective qualities of urban space has been very influential and also very, I think, very generative for visual anthropology in many ways. And then there's also a history of interest in cultural forms of wayfinding, dwelling, everyday places. Again, Taplin, Sheld, and Setha Lowe's study of urban parks and how people use urban parks from Philadelphia to New York City, but also Robert Rothenberg's work on timescapes in Vienna also talks about urban space at the level of everyday practices. We've usually approached these theoretical concerns through the traditional ethnographic methods for eliciting the participant's point of view. But with changes in the discipline, anthropology is now witnessing a shift towards involving communities in the co-construction of ethnographic knowledge. And to me, this is a logical extension of our long-standing commitment to the emic perspective. I talked about studying urban environments, but I'm also interested in transforming urban environments. The other half of my life at UMass is in the Center for Public Policy and Administration. And so I'm often in conversation with people who are in urban planning or in policy fields. And planners, designers, and policymakers all increasingly recognize the value of anthropology. What we're looking at here is a picture of what planners and designers call a desire path. It's a physical trace of where people want to go and how they behave in context. despite the best efforts of experts who provide pretty brick paths for them to go on. The ethnographic lens, in many ways, this is a great visual metaphor for the ethnographic lens. It affords insights into how humans make sense of their environment and what they do in practice, in context. And I think that that's one of the reasons why it's increasingly valued in fields like design and planning and policy. There's a whole field now called interpretive policy analysis that is very influenced by anthropology and ethnography. So new trends in design are also opening up paths to a more participatory approach. There's the field of participatory design, which engages residents and users in planning and designing spaces. And there's also universal design, which takes the practical and embodied knowledge of people living with disabilities as a starting point. But for anthropologists and for planners and designers, how do we get to this more participatory vision of what we are doing? How do we get there from here? The questions that I'd like to pose as I'm going through some of these explorations and what you can do with participatory visual and digital research in studying and transforming space. It's motivated by questions about how we can change the power dynamic between anthropologists and the communities we study, between designers and planners on the one hand, and residents and users on the other. To use the words of John Gaventa, can we push beyond seeing community members as, quote, users and choosers, and integrate them more fully into conceptualizing, studying, and analyzing problems, and also developing policies, designs, interventions, solutions. Those are the questions that I'm posing today. And these are some of the questions that animate why I have come to integrate participatory visual and digital research into the way I do anthropology. Participatory visual and digital research is the confluence of participatory action research, or PAR, and visual and digital media technologies, such as photos, video, GIS and mapping, and all sorts of multimedia. Although I am presenting this as a new thing, I don't want you to, I'm presenting it in that way because it's relatively new to me. But there are historical roots for these approaches that go back quite far. Participatory action research came out of the tradition of action research, sort of pioneered by Kurt Lewin in the 1940s, and also in Paulo Freire's work and Orlando Falls Borda, their approach to the sort of the Latin American school of participatory action research that came of age in the 1960s and 70s. And Paulo Freire and his colleague Augusto Boll were early innovators in using visual elicitation as a way of generating reflection and critical conversations. And visual anthropologists have also had a long interest in collaborative filmmaking over the years. There's Jean Rouche's sort of vision of a shared anthropology, Worth and Adair's through Navajo Eyes Project, and the long-term, sort of the career-long work of Sarah Elder and Leonard Kammerling in participatory filmmaking in Alaska. But what I've observed in the past decade is that more and more anthropologists are integrating a PAR approach with new visual and digital technologies. And so it's interesting to ask the question, why is this taking place now? One reason I see for this shift is that it's in part a response to anthropology's crisis of representation, as we called it in the 1980s and early 1990s to what some of us might be calling a participatory turn in anthropology. For those of you who weren't there, the crisis of representation was a moment when several different streams of critique of what was called traditional anthropology. We can nitpick about how traditional anthropology actually was, but three streams of critique, really starting with Native American scholars and post-colonial scholars in the 1970s, and then feminist and postmodern critics within and of anthropology, leveled a critique of the ways that anthropology's object of knowledge was portrayed, using literary analysis and applying that to our representations and the ways that we wrote about culture. There was the book Writing Culture, which really did that very systematically. And these led us to be much more self-reflective about how we create representations of the communities that anthropologists study. And it also heightened our awareness of power relationships within our research. Where I think that it sort of left off, particularly with the postmodern or post-structuralist critique, Writing Culture, the title of the book, gives you a sense of what the envisioned solution was. It's writing different kinds of ethnographies, and it led to some very adept experimental ethnographies and writing about culture in more creative and humanistic ways. But it was still writing culture. The assumption was still that what anthropologists do is we produce written scholarly texts. And I would say that post-colonial and feminist scholars had sort of a longer vision of how you would use how different ways of presenting and doing research could open up the discipline and address those power relationships. Alongside this critique, we've had more and more calls for engaged research, or return of calls for engaged research. And I think that is what has animated the discussion of public anthropology, and it's also led many anthropologists to turn to participatory action research, which is it's not that hard to go from ethnography to participatory action research, but the first step's a doozy in terms of the way that we are trained to think of our research as ethnographers, and opening that up and sharing power with research participants. In confluence with the participatory turn, we have a technological revolution in digital media as well. And while I always resist technological determinism, first, I say that, but I grew up in the Santa Clara Valley, which during my childhood became known as the Silicon Valley. So I resist technological determinism, but I also acknowledge that resistance can be futile. Because our tools come with cultural consequences. And visual representations of all kinds have become, to borrow filmmaker Errol Morris's phrase, fast, cheap, and out of control. They're fast in that less time is required for processing, editing, and presenting digital images. I know people who make ethnographic films go, less time is required, but because it is still extremely time-consuming. But film editing has been greatly simplified. Smaller technologies means that it's ever easier to make video, photos, and maps without lugging around heavy equipment. It's cheap in that not only is the equipment more portable, but it's less expensive. And the shift to digital media cuts out the need for expensive film and You can display images without even printing them because you can share them on the web. Of course, the fact that they're cheap and portable means that you can take even more footage, which won't save you time. But that brings us to out of control, which is, and what I mean by out of control is that anthropologists increasingly work in contexts where ubiquitous technology already connected to the web is already in use by our participants. And I think this morning's session on networked anthro really opened up a good exploration of what does that mean for the rest, for those of us who are anthropologists. Our research participants may be making their own images, and that decenters the ethnographic filmmaker or photographer as the source of authority. The display of images on the internet means that we also have less control over the circulation, contextual framing, and uses of the visual representations produced in our research. This opens up radical possibilities for collaboration, but it also raises unending, sticky ethical issues for researchers. So today I'm going to focus in on several different approaches that people are using, specifically to study urban environments. We're seeing anthropologists and other social scientists, especially our friends the geographers, who are usually already there when it comes to studying urban environments or space in general. And we're adopting an ever-growing assortment of visual research genres. These research modes range in the amount of technical expertise required, and they include participatory digital archives, museums, and exhibitions, participatory GIS and mapping, participatory video, digital storytelling, and photo voice. What all of these share is no matter what the media, when you're doing participatory visual and digital research, there are certain parts of the process that come along with it. The beginning of the process, working with collaborators, is negotiating goals. And actually, I'd like to back up at this point and say that although a lot of people just want to jump into participatory visual and digital research, or they discover PAR and they're so excited about it, they want to do it right now. Actually, traditional ethnography is a really good way of getting to know people and form the relationships that you need to have in order to move into this mode of research. So you need to have those entry points. But then researchers and participants are negotiating goals together and finding what's interesting to see in that process of the participatory action research is the different kinds of value that the research can produce for different people who are involved in it. There's also the question of how deeply can you engage and integrate participants in the research process. Usually when we're talking about participatory action research or participatory visual research, we've seen a lot of engaging participants in the research design phase and in the data collection phase. And moving into greater and greater integration of research participants as partners in data analysis and in communicating research is something that has it's either been done less or discussed less in academic writing. And I don't know if that's because people are still trying to lay claim to some kind of academic authority, or also because of participants aren't necessarily wanting to hang out and write boring scholarly articles. And that's something that can be negotiated, who does what. Using appropriate technologies is really important, and that's why sometimes you are very gung-ho about a specific technology or method, and it's just not going to work out for a certain project. You have to take into account cultural protocols, and if you've never seen it, Kimberly Kristen's website, Digital Dynamics Across Cultures, is a really good introduction to cultural protocols around visual representations. She worked with an Australian Aboriginal group to develop a website that was about their heritage, and yet the entire thing uses visual devices like duct tape, little images of sort of duct tape going across the screen to make people really self-conscious about, oh, this is a person who has died, and according to this cultural protocol, it's not appropriate for you to be looking at film of them. So cultural protocols are something to be aware of in terms of using appropriate technologies. Another thing to take into consideration is the skills that are available or desired in among the participants in the project. In some projects, capacity building, learning technological skills, learning your way around a computer, or gaining media production skills are integral to the project itself. That's Anthropology by the Wire, is really integrating media production into as a goal. But for other projects, participants may be more interested in the documentation itself and less, and developing skill itself is less central to them, either for reasons of time or interest. You have to take into account also resources for creating and maintaining websites. And then finally also the ownership and control of the images, which I'll get back to in a minute. So that's finding technologies that are appropriate. Sometimes you really want to do something, but it just doesn't, it's not a good match for the project. You also need to consider the ethics of representation. And I'll get into this in specifics in a few minutes. But thinking about visual stereotypes, if you are working with a group that has already been the subject of documentary filmmakers or journalists, photojournalism, or reality TV, there may be a lot of other images circulating that they would like to resist. So being aware of that. Sometimes taking photos or generating GIS data is risky for the participants. You need to think about that. Photo taking, as researchers, we think of participatory methods as, okay, the tables are turned, now the participants have the camera in their hands. But of course, they still have photographic subjects who they are in an ethical relationship with. So having discussions of that is important. And then all of the decisions that come after you've taken the photos from, or cropping, editing, and then how do you circulate? Where can you audience the images? And who owns them, or who can control the use of the images? These are things that scholars like, in particular, scholars working with using these methods with indigenous communities have to think about a lot. And in particular, I've been very inspired and learned a lot from the work of Kate Hennessy and also my colleague at UMass, Jane Anderson, on indigenous property. And finally, you have to, in the participatory visual and digital research process, anticipating audiences and dissemination is a part of the process from the very beginning. So you're going in and producing images with the idea that they will have some kind of use or circulation. And having those discussions as a research team is really important. So now I'm going to give some examples of these different approaches or modes in studying environments, studying urban environments using participatory visual and digital methods. And in many ways, I'm going from the most complex and work and technology intensive to the simplest. Right now, we're seeing an explosion, literally an explosion of participatory digital archives. These are projects that are happening outside of anthropology, sometimes in the community archive movement, but also it's a booming area in anthropology as this cohort of anthropologists who ushered in the critique of representation and the critique of ethnography are approaching retirement. Johannes Fabian, the author of Time and the Other, his contribution to anthropology in the 1980s is talking about how anthropological representations pin colonized people in past time and deny them what he called co-evilness. Not evil, as in bad, but EVAL, that co-evil existing together. And what he decided to do a few years ago is to repatriate his ethnographic audio recordings from Central Africa in an online archive. And he wrote about that as a process of being able to share back his research from the 1970s with Central African scholars and also the descendants of his research subjects so that they would be able to access these somehow. We're also seeing projects like the Field Museum. Alaka Wali and Madeline Tudor of the Field Museum in Chicago have used participatory action research to set up an online archive and virtual museum of materials related to the urban heritage of the Calumet region, just south of Chicago. This is a good example of researching and transforming urban environments because, on the one hand, it's a research resource and process. But on the other hand, this archive is also being used by community groups to try to establish a national heritage area that will preserve valued parts of a working class industrial region. With this project, the participatory action research is happening on the early end, in the research design and data collection phase of the archive. In this project, which is beautiful, Komunalka, it's a virtual museum of Soviet everyday life. And what it is it's an online collection of photos, videos, film clips, essays, floor plans of Soviet-era communal apartment buildings in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is one of the most expensive cities in the world, and these buildings occupy prime real estate. So they are constantly under pressure from gentrification. Anthropologist Ilya Utekin, who grew up in one of these buildings, made videos and organized with Slavic scholars and anthropologist Nancy Rees this virtual museum. It's participatory in the sense, in some ways, that Utekin is doing some auto-ethnography of his own, the spaces where he himself grew up. But then the other thing that is participatory about it is, as you explore this virtual museum, they invite you to curate your own tours on various themes. So as a visitor, you can create tours that are about any theme that you want. You can get things like consumer society in the Soviet era, or how did people deal with housework, or you can create a tour that's all of the things that you find that are related to conflict. So it allows the user at the end to be a more active creator, co-creator of curating this collection. And then you can post those on the site. Another area where with a lot of potential for studying urban environments is participatory GIS and participatory mapping. I say participatory mapping because one of the things that happens a lot from what I've heard in PGIS projects is that it's a steep learning curve, and yet the value of GIS in producing maps is really clear to any community that has tried to make changes with city council or any bureaucracy. Having your own maps is hugely valuable. So a lot of times you see more low-tech forms of participatory mapping being combined with GIS, where the researcher is doing a lot more of the technical side of things. I'm going to mention two cases that are not urban, but were hugely influential, important moments in and innovations in participatory GIS. One is the case of South Africa, where it's the earliest project using participatory GIS methods in the early 90s, was when geographers Daniel Weiner and Trevor Harris conducted community-based GIS to produce what they called counter maps in post-apartheid South Africa. These maps, they collected data on the ground to document a history of forced evictions of black households in South Africa. And these were used to contest apartheid-era planning maps that completely erased that history. So it was a way of producing counter maps, and the resulting GIS maps were used by the Department of Land Reform in the policy process, and they paved the way for reconciling land conflicts in South Africa during the 90s. Another really interesting example, and this is where the graphic comes from, is in New Zealand, the case of Maori GIS, which got started in the early 90s with a wave of legislation supporting Maori land claims, autonomy, and the rights of iwi, or tribes, to take part in public planning decisions. This was a watershed moment, and in practical terms, it meant that Maori communities suddenly needed a generation of people who were trained in zoning and GIS. So they turned to community-based GIS as a way of fusing indigenous knowledge and new technologies for public participation. So they used GIS for applying Maori place names, which are often very long, to maps and had been shortened or taken off of maps because they were said to be too long. It would cover up the entire island. But with GIS, that doesn't matter. You can use them. And also in considering indigenous property rights and cultural protocols when representing landscapes. So some of these layers are standard GIS: vegetation, water, and land and soil. And then others of them have layers that are confidential GIS layers with limited or protected access. So sacred sites, limited or protected areas, medicinal plants, all of those, they created layers that were protected, and instead of having a geocode, it says go talk to, and then whichever elder is the expert on that area. So it's a way of using GIS to actually reinforce indigenous knowledge in a new way. and in a way that it can be used in zoning decisions. There's also the concept of story mapping. And this is a screenshot of Third Ward Speaks, which is it's a project in Houston that was started by Carol Parrott-Blue and her colleagues at the University of Houston in partnership with Houston's Third Ward community organizations. By clicking on the faces on the map, you can see videos of community members sharing stories about the history of the buildings, the streets, the parks, important neighborhood institutions like barber shops, department stores, and coffee shops. And this project identified important places to be preserved or commemorated, and it also touched off a more participatory planning process for the neighborhood's redevelopment, which people were extremely anxious about given Houston's history of urban redevelopment in that neighborhood. And in very concrete terms, stories, videos from the map are going to appear in public transportation kiosks throughout the Third Ward. So it's not only going to be existing in sort of virtual space, but it's going to be integrated into new infrastructure in the neighborhood, so that these stories, sometimes about buildings that no longer exist, will be made visible again. I've been mostly talking about visual research, but I wanted to give a call out to sonic, which I do not do. Similar to Third Ward story mapping, this project Murmur Toronto uses locative or place-based storytelling as an approach. They collect stories from Toronto residents and create audio maps that can be accessed in the street by cell phone. Or you can go online and click on the spots on the map and hear them while you're sitting far away from Toronto. The process of collecting the stories and creating story maps can reveal hidden histories, city people's everyday wayfinding, and contribute to bottom-up placemaking. And actually, I would like to mention that another Murmur, the Murmur project, it has happened just down the road from here in Orange, New Jersey. So if you go to the Murmur website, you can check out the Orange, New Jersey site as well. Then I'm not going to say very much because we had a presentation from Matt Durrington and Sam Collins this morning, but Anthropology by the Wire, their project is truly multimodal, but participatory video is obviously a core method. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about their use of participatory video is it's an example of using small-scale community media to address how neighborhoods in Baltimore are portrayed in big media representations like the television program The Wire. One of the things that I'd like to add about participatory video is that the process of editing video itself, I think it's one of the areas where there is some really rich opportunities for collaborative data analysis. Carlos Flores' presentation, while working in a rural community, demonstrated the possibilities of video for this participatory data analysis as you make decisions and discuss what's going to go in and what's going to be left out of a video. With digital storytelling, somebody who's doing really exciting work in Dublin, Ireland, is Darcy Alexandra. And she has been, this is a picture from her project Living in Direct Provision, which it was a project where she's working with asylum seekers who are not allowed to hold jobs, but they are not being sent back to their country yet while they are waiting for their cases to be considered. So it's sort of a state of immigration limbo, and the digital storytelling process allowed this group of asylum seekers a chance to tell their stories. In a nutshell, digital stories are a 3 to 5 minute multimedia story that's created through a workshop process where participants they scan and upload their photos. They might use film clips. They create a storyboard and a narrative script for themselves, and then they do a voiceover. So it's a process that's very intensive in capacity building with participants in terms of gaining computer and media skills, but it also affords reflections for reflection for participants to reflect as a community, and for researchers to gain insights on the decisions that participants feel they have to make as they tell their story. And then finally, there's photo voice as a method for studying urban environments. And this is the method that I've used the most. It's probably the least technically complex, but its simplicity makes it accessible to a wide range of people, and it makes it, it produces images that can be used flexibly by researchers and participants. And what we're seeing a lot of now is more and more where these modes get mixed up. I'm presenting them as separate modes, but I've seen photo voice images that then get repurposed as as fodder for digital stories or things like that. So that's the remix that Sam and Matt were talking about this morning. Photo voice is actually very similar to a method that was used by Paulo Freire and Augusto Boal in the late 60s and early 1970s. And it came together as a method, kind of crystallized as a method when public health scholar Carolyn Wong wrote about it, based on her research with women peasants in China. And it has three major elements: participant-generated photography, photo elicitation, voice in the sense of photo elicitation discussions with a group of photographers, and then also being heard. And the way that I think about being heard or being seen and heard is the variety of ways that people use the images produced in photo voice to find audiences or reach policymakers. Typically, the end product involves a photo exhibition, but sometimes if the photo subjects are sensitive, or if the goals of the project are better suited to a different kind of product, people will use the images in other ways. So that discussion of what kinds of audiences do you want to reach is part of the research process throughout the process. I'm going to talk about the three places where I have used photo voice to study urban environments: Hungary, the US, and Portugal. And what I want to do with each of these is just to return to some of the ways that the modes of anthropology of urban environments that I began the talk with, they kind of roughly correspond with what we were doing in each project. In Hungary, we used photo voice basically as a way of documenting problems and values in a community and gaining an understanding of how members of the community saw their environment and experienced environmental injustice. In the US, we're looking more at that place for stories, the sense of place approach after urban renewal. And in the new project in Portugal, I'm getting drawn by the project itself into the world of sensory ethnography and questions of affect in urban gardening. So in Hungary, I was working in a small city in northern Hungary that was deindustrializing, really hard hit after 1989 when the state socialist glass factory was privatized, shut down, and all of the equipment that people in the community had worked in was shipped off to another country. The neighborhood where I was working with Yutka Bari, who was a community organizer there, was mostly a Roma or Gypsy neighborhood, and it was right next to the center of town and City Hall, but across the river and isolated from public infrastructure. So collaborating with this group, we both agreed that we wanted to document some of this exclusion from infrastructure. The research team was a group of 6 youth, and for Yutka, one of her goals in doing this project was to sort of build their leadership and their ability to, their confidence and their ability to speak in the community about these issues. So that was the group. We had discussions of research ethics, and then I distributed cameras, and we had we developed 2 themes, environment and health, and then the group was set loose to develop their own 3rd theme for the project. And the only guidance I gave them on what to photograph for each theme was that they should show the positive and negative things going on in their neighborhood. So I'm only going to look at some of the environment pictures, but what we got were pictures of values and issues in the environment. And one of the things that I can say, Roma in Hungary are definitely sort of the, they're the largest minority group. They face a lot of racism and discrimination. And one thing I can say is that they are not treated as people who are close to nature. They are treated as people who are, you know, unnaturally occupying space in Hungary, even though they have been living there for hundreds and hundreds of years and living settled in villages and speaking Hungarian for at least a century. So some of these pictures, the idea that Roma have a sense of nature or a sense of belonging to this environment was itself sort of a new question to be asking. And we got pictures of, you know, people enjoying the wetlands because the neighborhood is on the floodplains, but that also means a connection, a real sense of connection to the river. But we also got photos that illustrated how poorly maintained the public infrastructure was and how this woman was trapped in her house because the pipes kept bursting on the street. We got pictures, this picture, people loved the composition, but it actually provoked, I'm categorizing it as values because most people said, look, this is the kind of thing that we do all the time that nobody recognizes as green, but this is how people get to work and get around town in our neighborhood. But this picture actually provoked a discussion of whether or not it was a value or a concern because some people said, but look at how few cars there are. That shows how excluded we are and how we don't have access to getting around the way that people on the other side of the river do. Sewerage was a huge concern, and people, this picture opened up all sorts of stories that are behind the picture in terms of having outhouses in the backyard in this densely populated neighborhood means that parents don't want their children playing in the backyard because the backyard is seen as filthy and dangerous because all the parents in the neighborhood worry about their child falling into the outhouse. So this picture actually linked up with pictures that people took on the lack of of green space and parks for their children, because they saw a need for parks because people didn't want their children playing in the backyard. Water also was a huge issue. Only a few people in the neighborhood had access to indoor water. This is in Hungary. This is in Central Europe. But most people were getting water from buckets, taking buckets to the street tap. And I can't go deep into the stories that a simple picture like this will elicit. But I got to hear about people's arguments with their siblings over who has to carry the next bucket. I got to hear about in practice in the winter what happens if the faucet kind of stops up with ice, and all sorts of this visual cue opened up many stories about life without indoor water. And this picture is another water picture, and I want to put it up because I was in this house and saw these buckets, but I didn't see them until they were photographed by the person who lives in the house. And while I was talking to Claudia's mother, asking her if it was okay for her daughter to participate in the project, her sister came in with some buckets, put the water on the stove, left the room, took the water off the stove, left the room again, and came back like 20 minutes later with wet hair. I was there, but I was a little distracted talking to her mom, and it didn't occur to me so much that this is what all the 8 people who live in this house have to do every time they're bathing, and this is sort of the household gray water system, and all of the care and time it takes to manage water in the community. And then finally, we organized actually 2 photo exhibitions. One in the neighborhood. We were supposed to have it in the street, but of course there was a rainstorm, so we had to quickly find a covered porch to have it on. And what happened was the group used this moment and this collection of photos as sort of a prompt for them to write what we decided to call, to make it fancy, the Shio River Declaration on Environmental Justice, which as far as I know is the only statement in Hungarian, or the first statement in Hungarian on environmental justice. And we distributed it at the well, actually we posted it at the exhibition and then presented it again in Budapest. We had the group decide how are we going to run each of these exhibitions, because I want to talk a little bit about audiencing and the ethics of that. The process for developing the local exhibition, we spent a lot of time thinking about who specifically was in the pictures, because we didn't want to get too many cousins up on display so that people who weren't in a particular family didn't feel excluded. So it required a lot of local knowledge about who was related to who, because our goal was to make as many people in the community feel included in this discussion as possible. So the lack of social distance when showing it in the community really affected our decisions about how to display the images. In the capital city, in Budapest, we were having a fancy exhibition at the Central European University, and we invited people from the Ministry of the Environment and from Roma civil rights groups and environmental organizations to attend. And with that, we didn't have to worry as much about people knowing who was related to who, but there was a whole ecology of sort of photojournalistic representations of Roma that we had to take into account. And we also decided that we wouldn't have a standing exhibition. It would be a 3-hour event. We didn't want it to become an anthropological zoo. So people could come, look at the images, and engage with the photographers themselves. And then we took the images down, and that was the end of it. So those were decisions that we made about how to run the photo exhibitions in a way that we felt was ethical given the state of research and representations of Roma in Hungary. A couple more brief examples and then I'll close. In terms of the approach of using these methods to get at a sense of place or the stories of place, I've found that this kind of visual elicitation can be really incredible for talking about places that you can't see in doing research projects in sites that have been really affected by urban renewal. So last summer in Tallahassee, we had a photo voice project where participants, both students and community members, generated pictures. For the students, it was sort of their first impressions of Tallahassee. And for the community members, it was places that they wanted to alert the students to as important places. And this one was captioned, "Whatever Happened to 503 East Madison Street?" And you know, we all looked at this picture. It was one of the first ones. The Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. We're kind of wondering, you know, why are we looking at this? And then Miss Mayasha Mitchell, who is a community leader in Frenchtown, which is the historical African-American district of Tallahassee, said, "This is where I was born, not in this building, because the building I was born in was knocked down." But this opened up sort of a 45-minute discussion of urban renewal in Tallahassee and the changes that she saw in her life, and then other people jumping in and talking about places that had important places that had disappeared. So we're looking at this picture, but it's allowing us sort of a trigger to talk about places that no longer exist. A project that I did more recently last fall, I have not really had time to process it, was the Futurescape City Tour in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is, like many cities in the Northeast, a deindustrializing city that has a lot of good bones in terms of architecture and industrial history, and people who even still have some of those fine manufacturing skills, but no place to use them. In this project, it was actually a participatory technology assessment with a citizens panel of Springfield residents. And the way that it was organized was combining photo voice and a walking tour. And so some of the things that came out from combining walking around and participants taking pictures is, again, people took pictures of interstitial spaces that when we collected them, we're like, oh my God, what are we going to talk about? This is a picture of a vacant lot. Well, the research participants filled up the vacant lot with the stories of, they filled up the vision of the vacant lot with the stories of what was there before. Or this picture of a very banal sort of business center, tower in downtown Springfield, and the stories of the shopping center that was there before, that participants had, crawled the mall in high school, but then, that particular mall was seen as attracting, urban youth, and so it was shut down by the mall owners. So again, you're using photography in many cases, pictures that evoke things that are no longer visible for participants to get a sense of the history of a place. And then finally, I want to show a few slides from my new project in Portugal. I've been working with urban gardeners there, and in particular with this really interesting group called AVAL, which is a coalition, a neighborhood coalition of gardeners that come from a lot of different walks of life. It includes older migrants from rural Portugal who came to the city usually in the 60s and 70s, immigrants from former African colonies who came around the same time, and then also some younger university-educated eco-types who are coming to urban gardening as a form of sustainability. And urban gardening in Lisbon, it's one of the first things you notice about the landscape as you look around. There are these incredible, what they call hortas clandestinas, which is like clandestine, semi-legal, they're not underground, they're illegal gardens, but basically anywhere the weather's good and anywhere there's a vacant lot, people start planting food on it. Aval includes many people who have been growing gardens illegally, but they actually want to gain formal rights to farm in the city. And they, as some of their projects, they established Portugal's first Horta Acessível. So they also have a lot of gardeners who are working with disabilities in a garden that they just built according to universal design principles. And they've also been working for 4 years to extend this into a larger Parque Agrícola on a vacant lot on the edge of the city. And this project has been slow going because the land is managed by a public-private partnership, and neither the city nor the development corporation have been eager to release the promised funds during Portugal's economic crisis. This is a picture of Celia, who is a gardener working in the Horta Acessível, and one of the quotes from the discussion of this image was "Gostamos de mexer na terra," and that is, you know, I like to mess around in the dirt, and that was something that people say all the time. One of the things that I'm noticing about the photos and the way that people discussed these photos is that although, you know, back in the 80s, Paul Stoller criticized the visual as being, you know, sort of the privileged sense in the sensorium. In fact, a lot of times our visual materials are the most accessible way to get people to talk about other senses when they're not in situ. So the discussions, if you look at the transcripts of these discussions, you see a lot of sensory details and affective and emotional details. This is something that John Collier pointed out actually in the 1950s when he was doing sort of an experiment in photo elicitation to see if it was better than, you know, normal interviewing. He noticed that people told longer stories, they told more concrete details when they were talking about photos, and even adding details that weren't in the photos. And in the discussion, it also gets into the affective qualities of this gardener whose parents have been gardening her whole life, but she's never been able to do it with them because she has MS. And they were worried that she would fall down. And now she's able to garden with her parents, and so she takes this metaphorical, I'm not just getting my hands on the land, but able to do something in a new way. And then this picture, I'm mostly showing just because I love it. But this is a picture of the highway overpass next to the Horta Acessível and the proposed Parque Agrícola. And I like it because it's got the light and the shade and the weeds growing down this center crack where the rain falls through the highway overpass and the light comes through. But what's interesting is these sensory details and attention to this interstitial urban space that's right next to where they want to build the garden also allowed the photographer to express more affective and emotional content that she was attaching to this picture. She saw it as a metaphor of the patience and frustration that was required to get the Parque Agrícola established. And I think it also kind of stands in for the frustration of this generation of university-educated younger people in Portugal who have been stymied and stalled by high unemployment and seeking a sense of dignity and producing something through urban gardening. So a lot of these pictures talked about their sense of making something. The sensory details often poured into this desire to make something that I think says something broader about how people feel in Portugal at this moment in time. So some concluding thoughts I just want to leave you with are that all of these methods allow us new ways of eliciting stories and data, stories about environmental inequalities and racism, stories about place attachment and the places that have disappeared. Mindy Fullilove, in her book Root Shock, talks about the traumatic stress of urban renewal when familiar places that you love disappear or are destroyed before your eyes. All of the points of all of your wayfinding points disappear. And I think that some of the uses of these photos really relate to that sense. But also the sensory and affective dimensions of the city and how we can access these using visual media. It also allows us possibilities for engaging groups that have been excluded from the planning process by producing counter maps and identifying significant places, and also using exhibitions and moments where you get an audience to invite policymakers or people who you can make an intervention through just displaying the images. And instead of slapping a thick report on their desk or an Anthro article, you have this moment of simultaneity where you're both looking at the same picture, and it gives you a face-to-face encounter that can be, that can have a lot of impact. And again, there's also policy impact when participants and researchers communicate to decision makers, planners, designers, and the broader public, whether it's in the form of GIS maps, photo exhibitions, or multimedia films, or multimedia websites. Thank you so much for your attention. I farm out most of the photography.
Do you find yourself looking at things differently and paying as much attention to how these photos communicate? I would think you could start to produce photos as well.
Yeah.
That can do some of that communicating.
I would say I wouldn't dare to say that it's made me a better photographer, but it has made me use photography as a focusing tool and a way of focusing my attention on things, and that probably does make you into a better photographer. I've also, in sort of gross terms, I've learned very basic tricks, because on the one hand, with your participants, you want them to take pictures and feel comfortable with themselves, but you also want them to create images that they are excited to show. And so I have learned to give some very basic composition tips, but then also to tell people to break any tips or rules, if that doesn't get their message across. So I've absorbed a little bit of that, but I think that the main thing is how photography now serves as a memory aid and focusing tool for me. And I'll tell you what it's really changed. It's changed my writing, because I used my photos as visual prompts, and that makes it, I used to get out my field notes, which is also a good way to get started with writing ethnographic work, but now I just pull up a picture and say, okay, I have no excuse, write about it. Yeah.
I guess it's kind of related to that. I was thinking about this idea of better and good photography, like the aesthetic, the tension between our aesthetics and this idea of what do I want to show in this US context or in this UK context, what could go into an exhibition that wouldn't necessarily be what other people think is a good photo or a good image, and it's something that I've not necessarily struggled with, but noticed in my work, that saying take pictures of what's important to you. It might not be this stunning image, but that doesn't matter. I'm trying to get over that. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that kind of subjective, good photography.
Well, I think that that's one of the things that's liberating for me about not being a person who, came of age thinking of myself as a visual anthropologist. In fact, I think I was drawn to the participatory side because it allowed me to sort of foist off responsibility for image making to my participants. But I think that what constitutes a good image, a good picture, these pictures serve a lot of different purposes. The picture of the Fish and Wildlife building in a photo exhibition will probably be a fairly boring and bewildering image without a caption. It's not a standalone image. And yet, we discussed it for 45 minutes. And partly we discussed it for 45 minutes because I wanted to show the students in the summer field school how far can we go with just talking about one photo that's not particularly visually arresting, you know, which then posed a problem because we had to only like 10 minutes for everybody else in the group to talk about their photo. But so what's a good picture, you know, in terms of generating discussion about change in the community? That was a great picture. Probably there were definitely other pictures in that collection that I would probably do, you know, a larger blow up if I was making it into a photo exhibition. Yeah. Yes?
What do you see as the end result of the work in Springfield?
What do I see as the end result
Yeah,
of the work in Springfield?
Yeah.
You know, that project was the Futurescape City Tour project. It was a 6-site National Science Foundation project. So Springfield was just one site of it, and so the originators of the Futurescape City Tour are sort of science and technology studies people, not necessarily anthropologists, and they may have, you know, different visions. I think it's very interdisciplinary, so people have different visions of what they wanted to do. For me, you know, my goal was sort of to learn about Springfield, and to learn about what happens when you get residents walking around together in a citizens panel. It was quite different from other projects that I've done because I wasn't working with a pre-existing community organization. I was doing a panel that was we tried to get a cross-section of Springfield in terms of neighborhoods, which Springfield has very different neighborhoods, and it was really important to try to get as many neighborhoods represented as possible. And so getting this very sort of diverse group of people to walk around town together and take pictures and then talk about it in discussion, that was kind of, at this point, what I'm seeing as what I am taking out of that experience. What, in terms of the public, you know, the experience for the participants, the day of walking around, we were meeting with scientists from UMass who explained how different technologies could potentially change the city. So it was sort of a science education event. It was a public deliberation event. I think some people see it as developing capacity for citizens debating technological, you know, innovations. But we also, for our exhibition, we also in the discussion we had them arrange their photos on a timeline of the future of Springfield, with the top was more desirable futures and the bottom was less desirable futures. So we had people putting up pictures of the highway overpass that has been dividing the city from the Connecticut River for decades, and they said, this will be here forever, you know. But then we were also surprised, you know, because Springfield is like many cities in the Northeast. It's kind of deindustrializing and gritty, and there were so many hopeful pictures as well. So it was interesting to see their perspectives on Springfield's future. But our last project, it was going to just be a photo exhibition. It turned into sort of a micro makers fair, because we took the participants to a makerspace on the edges of Springfield, and we saw, you know, 3D printers and people who were making cool stuff. And then the people on the tour, you know, there were at least 3 of them who said, oh, I've invented a solar cooker. I've invented my own kind of generator. I do stuff in my garage. So we decided that we needed to get together again so that they would have a chance to bring the things that they had made and share them with the makerspace people.
We have time for like one more question. Are there any others?
Yes.
I would just want to kind of, I guess, go back to like this kind of question of aesthetics, you know, because I mean, I think that like it does make sense what you're talking about, like sort of putting cameras in people's hands. But at the same time, if you're kind of thinking about like sort of making political change and sort of getting the broad, you know, like the quality of that image does really matter. And I was wondering if you have considered or see, considering actually sort of like identifying image creators as a kind of another stakeholder or that could be at the table. I guess I'm kind of thinking specifically to this project called, I think it's called the Solitary Prisoners Photography Project, where people in solitary confinement can describe the picture that they want to see, and then then it gets posted on a website, and then somebody can I'll go take a picture of that, and then kind of send it. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And so,
that's an interesting question. I think that a lot of times what goes on in the aesthetics is if there's somebody on the team who is very good at making the kind of aesthetic decisions about how to crop and how to perk up the photos so that they are more interesting, while they're participant generated photos, that can make an exhibition really come alive. And a lot of times the participants, they don't object to that. It's exciting for them to see it look, the number one thing is people love seeing their own photos big, because most people only have snapshots or now phones with images, not printouts. In terms of, what I would say has happened in almost every photo voice project that I've done is that people who are it's almost sort of a way of identifying the talent for sort of the organic intellectuals, the organic image makers of a community. And you have to be a little careful because when it's time for the photo voice discussion, you don't want to privilege those people over other participants who may have something equally valid to discuss, but whose images are more boring or more blurry or have a thumb in the corner of them, because there's always that. But you almost always end up finding people who are creating really exciting images from the community. And then that, for me, is what's exciting, because then they can be using those images and feeling that sense of ownership, which particularly, I think that comes from my very first project in Hungary, working with Roma activists, a Roma civil rights activist, years before I did this project, said, oh, you know what the problem is? The Roma are the most photogenic ethnic group in Europe. and he was complaining about, this is a group that is not only sort of studied to death. There's research fatigue. There's the sense that people study them and leave. That they are interesting only because they're a social problem, and that you can take these gritty social sort of realist photos and establish your credibility as a photojournalist by venturing into the dirty Roma ghetto or whatever. That was because of that. I would have said that doing a photo project in a Roma community was the last thing I would have ever expected myself to do. But my research partner, Yutka Bari, who is now making films, she was the one who lured me into it, because she said, the youth are going to want to take pictures. They've already done interviews, and that was interesting for one round, but they are going to want media if we're going to keep them engaged in this project. And she also said, and besides, just because other people have, been taking pictures of us for a few decades, it doesn't mean that we don't get a turn. So reframing it like that, I think that's why I've always seen it as a process of shaking out, maybe, or people discovering their talent for representing their own story.
Thank you so much.